Hello everyone, today we talk about Lysimachos' army. I have my series about the Diadochi forces that we haven't updated very often. We made a video about Peucestes' army. In general, we have a Hellenistic warfare playlist where you can find this stuff, also the Diadochi playlist. There is sort of Macedonian warfare broadly meant, especially in this generation after the Megas's death. Lysimachos is a quite fascinating character on its own, essentially developing a regional power revolving around Thracian. There is the famous Lysimachus, also in later military history that in fact was founded after his name. And that was considered a bit like a dark figure by his foes, obviously, but say he passed down to history with this aura, so to say. And I use the term because it turns out that he was actually a pretty competent and shrewd leader that, of course, like many at his age, would meet his fate in quite painful ways, but also showed, of course, the might of the Macedonian military in this pretty convoluted time after the death of Alexander. So these videos are not meant to make much of a history, say, about Lysimachos per se. Again, I have to start a series properly about Hellenic and Hellenistic history. They will surely talk about him there. Still haven't started that, but again, it's necessary. Today, we essentially talk just about his army organization and composition. In other videos, we will see battles where he fought, but just as single battles, not much for Lysimachos himself. So, if you are acquainted with Schwerpunkt's content, organizational logic, so to say, you know why we operate like this. It may seem like we do things piece by piece, but essentially we're focusing on the army composition. And of course, talking about the historical character as well. So, Lysimachos was one of Alexander the Great's somatophylakas, that is to say, elite bodyguards. So we're looking at that hardcore Macedonian, nobiliar, equestrian, militarily exalted aristocracy that conquered the literal world, like in this amazing feat that would make Alexander, in fact, the greatest commander in the history of mankind, the same Romans following on his footsteps, molding the world in his own image. Like, it's really imprudent to try to frame like all the achievements of Alexander to enter in his megalosychic vision, which is, again, something, if anything, we'll have to explain better, mostly through perspective of religion than warfare. But as you know very well, especially for this man, the two things deeply intertwined. It would have been better to discuss the Macedonian aristocracy and their formidable heavy cavalry better in other videos. If anything, a couple of months ago I made a video about the Hellenistic Xistopheroi during, in fact, this exact period. And in many ways, aside from the nomenclature that refers to the specific weapon used by these cavalrymen, they pretty much mirrored also what we normally consider as like the etairoi, other forms of heavy cavalry that are a bit the same Macedonian ultra heavy one, but that sort of underwent some change and or was also at some point called in different terms. And there you get a bit like the psychophysical background of these individuals. And so on top of that, consider having been in the retinue of Alexander himself through, in fact, much of his deeds. Actually, we do not know much about the previous part of Lysimachos' history. We'll briefly address it for the sake of completion. The most, you'd say, the beginning of his epopee is the appointment to governor of Thrace in 323, following the Megas's death at Babylon. And Lysimachus' role as a somatophylax, of course, required proven martial skills, and surely, given his proximity to Alexander, witnessed him as a fighter in the major battles like Issus in 333, Gaugamela 2 years later, the Eudaspes in 326 at the gates of India, honing his expertise in Macedonian combined arms tactics, art of war all around, and including, again, any type of panoplistic expertise, including, again, fighting prevalently as a knight, but being surely able to fight dismounted as often as men, especially also in storming fortresses. You know how much Alexander himself will risk even at the edges of the world. And even like lighter weapons, again, the elite was trained in the employment of every type of weapon, regardless of how they would have preferentially fought. And it would still happen, of course, that during the same battle they would have to switch those roles. And they were, in this sense, even better than the individual specialists that regularly employed those weapons in battle, right? Which also summarizes how incredibly impacting the role of, say, the companion cavalry would be, and what kind of metaphysical surpassing properly of any concept of fear, of like of mortality in their hope, in their pursuit. These men were properly brought up, right? People grow up through these mechanisms. There is always an initiation, right? But then you become capable of handling more and more and more. And this is basically also the broader story, in fact, of the Diadochoi, most of the Diadochoi. We talk also about other figures that are not, I don't know, we made a video about Pyrrhus that is not a Diadochos, but say ideally, because when we talk about the Diadochoi, we can refer to either, in fact, just like the immediate successors of Alexander, his generals, those who eventually parceled his own empire, or the Diadochoi as just the successors in general. So basically, in fact, in the video, in the playlist that I titled Diadochoi, basically talks about all the military history, mostly, as far as we have made videos mostly just about that, of the various reigns that emerged after the death of Alexander, specifically under Macedonian rule. Naturally, it's complicated to make to draw a profile of the character of the individual. I mean, the history is notorious. People get sometimes very sort of sophisticated about certain parts in history. You know that the Diadochoi, for some reason online, receive a much deserved appreciation. There are some historical topics that are somehow important but not appreciated, or vice versa. At least the Diadochoi receive the appreciation they deserve. That's also why we should actually talk more about them. But very often this appreciation may be relatively, I don't know, following the trail for some other strange facade reason that often betrays some kind of weird understanding of history that can be either deterministic or just, chauvinistic or whatever. History is beautiful in the moment in which you actually sort out what actually happened, if you can, to the best of your possibilities. And of course, a full description of Lysimachos' profile requires a much bigger video than this. But we can grasp something about his skills, his character, and capacities through his army, right? So the appointment to governor of Thrace occurred during, as we were saying before, the Babylon settlement in front of the corpse of Alexander that was not dead, according to the traditional doctrine of struggle and victory. The Diadochoi, the successors, divided Alexander's empire under the supervisions at that point of Perdiccas, the Chiliarch, with Lysimachos receiving, in fact, Thrace, a region that was relatively peripheral compared to sort of the richest part of the empire, but that was actually critical in strategical ways, especially for its control of the Hellespont, surely fraught with challenges at the same time due to its warlike Odrysian, Getae, and Triballi tribes in the interland. This proximity, in fact, to the fairly unstable Danubian frontier, necessitating thus constant military readiness. This would naturally oblige the same Lysimachus to take adequate countermeasures in the moment in which he was installed in there, and so to start calculating what were the best political and strategical options from his position. Thrace was strategically vital, in particular for securing trade routes and naval operations along the Black Sea and the Hellespont, providing access to key ports and resources for sustaining campaigns. This is particularly important within a strictly Macedonian context, because at this point Alexander has opened to Hellas the gates of not just of Asia but also of Egypt, and think how basically from that moment onwards, aside in fact from the political fragmentation of the Diadochoi, this is the point I wanted to make, the Egyptian grain will be directly imported by the Westerners for the first time to feed their cities mob in the northern shores of the Mediterranean. But indeed, Macedon, as you know, if you have a basic idea of how the partition of the empire went down, and especially the various adjustments, especially during this first generation, for the Balkans, for Greece in general, the Black Sea grain was quite crucial, as much as, of course, the straits that controlled its access. Right, Thrace was historically and mythologically conceived from an Hellenic standpoint as a land of savages, basically, this big demographic pool of barbarians, quite skilled in ambushes, in hit-and-run tactics, perennially unstable in creating problems to the Hellenic colonists of the Black Sea and the western, in fact, the Balkan coast of the Black Sea and the Marmara Sea, even parts, of course, of the Aegean. In terms of local resources, aside from some interland assets like important mines, the same Argead dynasty had to secure to properly fund under Philip II the establishment of the traumatically and astronomically expensive Macedonian phalanx, as Macedon, as you know, in the north of what was conventionally understood as the Hellenic world, was mostly like a feudal country, ruled up to a few generations just by this rough equestrian aristocracy, and not much of a particularly strong infantry, right? Things changed, like I made multiple videos about properly the Hellenistic art of war. We'll come back on that. Naturally, at this point, the Diadochoi found themselves in control of specific Macedonian veterans of Alexander. In fact, the men that they had themselves down the hierarchical line commanded, that were literally the best soldiers in the world. So naturally, much had changed, even if not in this enormous span of time. Nevertheless, Thrace, just by scale of importance, it was a relatively sort of B-series province in Alexander's empire, and in fact could not even produce this enormous resources in the immediate moment. It was close to Macedon. It controlled the access we've seen to Asia from Europe, especially by, again, stretches of sea that you can consider like just a land bridge. And this is the reason why during the early phases of the wars of the Diadochoi, Lysimachus adopted a cautious approach, like avoiding, first of all, the intense political rivalries that were running rampant among Alexander's generals, to say the least, such as the wars between Perdiccas and Antigonus I Monophthalmus, or the power struggles involving Antipater. These are, as you know, very big names. I actually want to start a series about Antipater because he is, you know, another great a successor that deserves, in my opinion, a bit more of attention. We're talking about gigantic warfare, right? Alexander had conquered this enormous part of the globe, and in a sense, most of his work in handicapped living would have consisted in sort of putting it back together. He had a couple of campaigns, for example, in already conquered lands, or almost, let's say, securing some secondary theaters before launching his renovated attempt to conquer India. Of course, when his guidance, his charisma, his unspeakable leadership passed, the Adochoi could not match it, and so in part they started fragmenting their own. So, as we've seen, sharing the empire in different parts for each, but also they had themselves to address some internal issues to this world and to the basis, after all, from which they had started themselves, that were incredibly challenging. Yet, in spite of this reduction by scale, the actual clashes were enormous. We're talking, again, especially the finest soldiers that had been part of the same army now turning against one another in this clamorous battles are really very interesting to study. There are relatively few sources about them, but that's also why classical history is at this point really Hellenistic, especially in the Hellenistic ways, is quite fascinating, a bit mysterious to reconstruct as well, and we will surely do it in some video again soon. That's the context in which, like, Lysimachus thinks, okay, if I want to survive here, I have to start by, first of all, consolidating my resources and keeping a low profile up to a certain moment, but still thinking big in the process in function of a proper expansion. That's when he consolidates his authority over Thrace, right? You wanted especially to secure the strategic Hellenic coastal cities like Byzantium, Perinthus, and Odessus. The latter is, by the way, modern Varna, that one of the Crusade in 15th century, which were already that important at the time. The first is Constantinople, and that actually yielded an important amount of economic and also naval advantages through their ports and tribute, because basically the Greeks had been colonizing as usual just the coast. They hadn't really needed to simply enter the hinterland. The Macedons were different because in many ways they were sort of borderline barbarian in their political and social organization compared to people living, I don't know, in Athens or Sparta. These other polis were, say, traditional coastal cities. They had in part also been influenced by the local Thracian customs, because that's eventually what happened to all these various colonies in a way or another. And they were unavoidably the gateway to the hinterland that had basically the most important, that didn't have the force to dislodge the Greeks, and that therefore also relied on their markets to export basically towards the sea. And that's how the mechanism fundamentally worked. Like, you didn't need an excessive continental expansion to control these territories. But every once in a while also had to check the various tribes, the various powers laying like in the hinterland itself. We can't think these polis that we just listed being bolstered by garrisons of something like between 500 and 1,000 Macedonian veterans, as well as light Thracian auxiliaries, including peltasts and javelin-armed skirmishers, that were ideally suited to the region's rugged terrain and frequent tribal ambushes like the ones that they themselves were the same people. Setting that, a couple of months ago I made a video about Thracian infantry, so of this exact period. So if you're interested in it, you can get the full picture about that. I also made a video about Thracian peltasts, I think one of the very, very early ones on Schwerpunkt, but we will come back on Thracian warfare as well. So Lysimachus is tied to this Thraco-Hellenic background at this point. Around 320, he successfully subdued Ceuthus III, king of the Odrysian Thracians, that, as you know, were the most powerful kingdom, right, having subdued in turn other tribes, which allowed Lysimachus, in fact, to integrate part of the same realm to his domain through real military campaigns, in fact, in the interland, including pitched battles and at fortified strongholds like Seuthopolis, where his 3,000 strong phalanx in 500 Thracian cavalry outmaneuvered Odrysian forces near the Hymus mountains. This aspect is interesting because it shows you how relatively contained these forces were, even if, as we'll see now, better Lysimachus did not really have all the troops in the world. This was just like maybe a half of his entire forces in the moment, so he also gambled and risked, but the reason why he would actually enter the aforementioned interland is that, of course, the Odrysians were concentrating an important amount of wealth in this continental theater, and by subduing that, you could simply grab them for you know what. So the thing worked necessarily through force, but not only, because you couldn't quite extirpate the Thracians or simply going into a forever war with them. There was, we're not fully sure, but likely a marriage alliance with a member of Ceuthus' family. Right, this was really common among Hellenistic rulers, like to secure loyalty. Besides, it was mostly a Thracian interest, like marrying into the race of the world rulers was at this point gigantic for tribesmen that, yes, had been seeking, say, kingship, but eventually not being able to stand their ground against the most advanced Macedonian military, even when being part just of this provincial governor's force, right? The intervention against the Odrysiae was also obvious, given the fact that we're just next to the Black Sea and the Aegean coast, threatening the fact that those the aforementioned polis, that was the point, the Thracians were constantly harassing them. So knocking that power out, keeping it under was obviously like a first step of Lysimachus' policy. However, the Balkan hinterland was much rougher, right? The various tribes that populated this were quite difficult to, let's say, to control. They were just pretty warlike, but especially fragmented. On top of this, north of the Danube laid the powerful tribe of the Getae that I will skip now any ethnographic consideration, but as you know, they were paired at some point with the Thracians themselves. There is the idea of the Ghetto Thracian peoples or something like that. They were fairly similar, like if think about the Dacians substantially, what they would become known better as such, and mostly sharing this affinity with the Thracians, also having been historically in contact with Macedon, mostly thanks to their own, as you know, precious metals that allowed their aristocracies to import a great deal of Hellenic arms and armor. Right, find very similar panoplies to the Macedonian ones sometimes in the Carpathians, and this people was more distant. There was no way fundamentally to simply subdue, and at least there could have been a general suzerainty recognition in favor of Lysimachus from the Getae, but he failed to defeat them. A testament to the Getae power at that point, that in fact successfully repelled Lysimachus' campaigns around 315 BC under the Getae leader Dromichaetus, going as far as capturing Lysimachus' son Agathocles in a skirmish near the Danube Delta, a place that we have talked forever about. Basically, it's the frontier of every place, basically, in military history. And it's always about those damn settlements there that allow to enter different realms, either the Pontic steppe or the Balkans, or also that more Central European dimension. And that, in fact, control the trade flow from Central Europe, from the Celtic world, etc. And so it's so strategic in many ways that most of the fight, in fact, it's not like Lysimachus wanted to enter the Carpathians. It was about contending these also fairly stretched garrisons up there that were, in fact, relatively distant in terms of political strategic control from the Getae themselves, given their, of course, less developed social political forms. In fact, what happened apparently is that 2,000 Getae warriors used guerrilla tactics in this very, as you know, swampy, amphibious contest to outflank Lysimachus' Macedonian 4,000-man force. Was conventionally heavier. Of course, he would have known how to go campaigning in places like that where lots of Thracians fighting for Lysimachus as well. However, the Getae eventually released Agathocles to negotiate peace, if anything, and deter further incursions, because there wasn't realistically much of a direction there, even enough manpower, resources for Lysimachus to simply take over these places, even as far as Central Europe with his meager resources, when you had literally Asia next door and all the political upheavals that could have triggered your intervention, as well as in Hellas, etc. So that was just like a proof of character, like testing these neighbors, showing who's in charge. And so this was a success overall for Lysimachus that, in fact, showed these barbarians that they didn't have to bother him, right, as long as it was there. Everybody liked trade. Yes, these peoples had thought they could expand here and there after Alexander's death, but now the Thracian governor would prevent them. So normal frontier business. Now, among the Diadochoi, Lysimachus gained, as I was hinting at before, this pretty dark legend reputation as ruthless and ferocious, often described by ancient sources as a villain and a barbarian, due to his brutal tactics, but also the fact that this had been prompted by the frontier land that we just discussed, why a barbarian, like possibly also because he was ruling from a land of barbarians and of the worst kind, let's say, at least in the Hellenic mentality. But there are these voices. For instance, he would have been notorious for slaughtering mercenaries to deter desertion, as seen in his execution of 600 Autariatae that were one Illyrian tribe mercenaries after their possessions were looted in 306 following a campaign against rebellious Thracian tribes near the Strymon River. And again, in 307 BC against the Triballi, where he executed 300 mutinous troops to enforce discipline. So Thracians, Triballi, Illyrians, you have these unpronounceable names, etc. Objectively, who cared about them? If you really had to make an example of them, exterminating several hundreds of them was not even the worst thing you could do. I mean, these are the same places where later Vlad Tepes would impale hundreds of Ottomans. Later on, it was just a local custom. Come on, you have to be open and inclusive, after all. So country you go, you customs, you adapt to it. So Lysimachus also employed deceit to capture polis, such as his seizure of Ephesus in 294. That was a very important feat. As you know, these places were some of the most brutally advanced in civilization. At that point, it was the same location for the same one of the seven wonders of the world, the Temple of Artemis, and just controlling the Ionian part of Asia Minor meant to be an incredibly powerful leader. Again, we're not following today even specifically step-by-step Lysimachus' actions, policy, and strategy. But of course, if you control it within the straits, you tend to follow the path of wealth, especially where politics is more destabilized. And at this point, that was particularly the case, especially for Asia, but not only. And on that occasion, Lysimachus had disguised his soldiers as civilians to infiltrate its defenses. This tactic had been paired with rapid assaults and siege engines like battering rams and 20-meter siege towers to secure urban centers. This was part of the broader, what would be properly and as literally become polyurcetical capacity of the Diadochoi. Given that this, as you know, had been booming just in Alexander's times, that had pulled off some of the greatest military engineering feats in the history of mankind, including the bridging of the island of Tyrus, creating the isthmus like during the siege to storm the city. Lysimachus had distinguished himself with a similar ruse in 305 to capture Calatis, where he had lured 4,000 defenders into an ambush by feigning retreat, allowing his 2,000-strong phalanx and 500 cavalry to overrun the city. This may have been learned as a trick, maybe because of his Thracian influence, not necessarily, especially when we think it may have been as well, but in sort of increasing, as we'll see now, also relatively the agility of the phalanx. This is also a relatively small amount of troops, telling the truth, so you can more easily do it. But I explained in some of my videos, and we will see this especially even, I don't know, since the time of Philip II, Battle of the Orchomenus. I don't know if you have ever studied this part of military history, but the Macedonian phalanx, when properly commanded and trained, and also with a bit of luck, could pull off major feats in terms also, for example, of changing front all of a sudden, withdrawing in orderly fashion, etc. Again, Lysimachus knew his deal, given this information. That earned him this sort of shady reputation. But, after all, other commanders were doing harsher things. So that despite these methods, Lysimachus actually proved to be a shrewd politician and capable military leader, to say the least, adept at balancing diplomacy, such as his alliances, for example, with Cassander, Seleucus I, Nicator, also Ptolemy I Soter. We will look at these in sort of the bigger picture at the time. These were, as you know, the biggest players especially in the Levant, right? And he definitely had to be extremely careful about his eastern flank in that regard, because they were much more powerful rulers than he was, even though they, in fact, were always sort of one step away from being annihilated by their competitors. This brought, by the way, to Lysimachus' 302 BC marriage to Ptolemy's daughter Arsinoe II, with the use of brutal force to expand his power more directly, including the use of 3,000 Thracian peltasts and light cavalry in mobile strikes against tribal foes and Hellenic rebels alike. Again, perfectly understandable policies and strategies in these contexts. Lysimachus' foundation of his namesake city, Lysimacheia, in 312 on the Thracian Chersonese near modern Gallipoli, the one of World War I, one of the many Callus polis. You understand here on the straits, so strategic at the time as it was today, strengthened in fact his control over the Hellespont as the critical trade and military route that it was connecting Europe and Asia. So you see these fortifications, including a 12-meter high wall and a moat a garrison of 1,500 troops to secure it against tribal raids and Scythian incursions from the north. This is also a very interesting aspect of the story because it's not like Thrace is isolated from the world. We'll see now, first of all, that there is Macedon next door, which is not very settling, if you, especially if you are Diadochos in the ruling from Thrace. But there is this historical sort of Pontic dimension that since the Bronze Age had witnessed these waves of marauders, war bands from, in fact, what would be the Ukrainian steppe at this point, with bands of Scythians that were, as you know, in just for the raids. They tended to destabilize and plunder along the way that was mostly, in fact, the coastal one that they could better follow, especially when there was a power vacuum that would allow them to pass through. So fortifying the straits immediately shows us how Lysimachus wanted to consolidate this launching pad from leaving open different opportunities, different directions were to expand, and in fact controlling fortifications that were not easy to storm, to simply take in a blitz. All right, we see a consistent amount of forces garrisoning Lysimachus. In fact, will remain one of the most important, one of the most strategically critical, not one of the biggest, but one of the most strategically critical Hellenistic polis later on in the in fact in the Hellenistic world, and especially in the region. So much so that Lysimachus also served as capital of Lysimachus' realm. As a fortified stronghold, it also housed a mint for Lysimachus' silver coinage, and a naval base with 30 triremes and 5 quinqueremes, showcasing his administrative foresight and ability to project military power, including naval one across the Hellespont to Asia Minor. If you wanted to control these coastal polis, you really needed, of course, to be able to gain some sort of local naval superiority so that you could resupply them against enemies that at most, unless they were other Macedons, would have not really used any critical naval force. I mean, these other people's villages that did go by sea as well, but they couldn't quite cope with such military forces. As you understand this better, was relatively minor, but still enough to keep, especially the barbarian, the tribes of the hinterland down, right? In fact, if you really want to assess Lysimachus' power, in 322, at the beginning of his journey, his army was really modest, comprising approximately only 4,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. The proportion is also interesting because it shows the importance of the mounted arm. By the way, consider this tendentially heavier Macedonian cavalry mowing down lighter Thracian cavalry and infantry alike, safe not falling into some ambush along the way. These men were, by the way, primarily Macedonian veterans, right, as assigned to him at Babylon, where all the troops of the Megas had been concentrated, the bulk of them. However, also hired mercenaries that at some point could have been also the same thing. And imagine some Macedonian veterans that had already been discharged, as you know, at some point, maybe returning under the form of private contractors of sort. But mostly we are talking when, especially the sources of the time make the distinction, quite specifically other types of troops, really. For example, 1,000 Hellenic hoplites. Again, you can draw this divide between Macedon and Hellas in a strictly military sense. And here, if we're told that they are hoplites, regardless of the generic term, they would have still been, again, likely mercenary Hellenic hoplites serving from some of these polis that were a bit more adventurous, in fact, than the more subtly concentrated, Athens, Sparta, etc. In the Thraco-Hellenic world was just the the Siciliot one, the Celto-Hellenic, etc., the Celto-Italic, were tendentially more warlike. The poleis were not quite like in Hellas. They tended to be mixed, to have, in fact, barbarian forces to sort of fluidify it as the same rigidity of, especially a political warfare. That was something historically, at least, as ideally tied. We just made a video the other day about the classical Hellenic hoplite to that way of war that took place in Greece. This had been changing, and not just because of the rise of Macedon and of its combined armed tactics. That, always remember, it has literally nothing to do with Hellenic classical political warfare, right? It's a completely different strategic principle, right? Regardless of what you say, but the hoplites, you figured that does not matter, right? Here we're talking about hammer and anvil. That's something that the Greeks did not go by historically. And you really need Philip II and Alexander III for witnessing something else entirely. You have, also because Macedon, Alexander notoriously fought, and not only him, against other Greeks, right? Those were actually the greatest threat to him, while conquering the Achaemenid Empire, as you know, especially in that westward dimension, rather than, in fact, the Persians themselves. So Lysimachus would have this 1,000 Hellenic hoplites, 1,000 Thracian light infantry in that moment, 500 Paionian light cavalry. The Paionians were similar peoples to, in part, the Macedons and the Thessalians. They were renowned for their cavalry, at least in part, not just that. These were, again, peoples from the rugged Balkan hinterland, which were, in fact, altogether, if you consider them ideal for especially the Thracian rugged terrain, as well in the guerrilla-style tribal warfare, but not only, right? And again, we were talking about this also regarding Thracian infantry. Yes, at large it would have been fairly light, but they also stood their ground as heavies, and some of them were heavy. And here there is all this shading from the tribal to sort of the statal, right, towards Hellas, towards Macedon itself. At this point had also further consolidated with all the wealth that it had received through Alexander's conquest, etc., towards something that we made a video about, the Antigonid army organization. We've seen that it was also the one that sort of stuck the most doctrinally wise to infantry preeminence. If you look at the end, aside from the fact Macedon still, by the time it fell to Rome, had the highest proportion of Sarysophoroi, Pizzataroi, among his troops compared to, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, and basically anybody else at that point, because, again, the Seleucids were a bit more inventive. The Ptolemies were a bit too sort of financially inefficient to maintain in the long run even large bodies of Sarysophoroi. And instead, Macedon really did. Now, 322 BC, if we see 20 years later, or slightly more, 301, Lysimachus' influence had grown significantly, and you can see this through the size of his army that had truly become a regional might, to say the least, one that could rival, in fact, with the other, the one of the other Diadochoi. In fact, he was estimated to have around 44,000 infantry, including a solid bulk of 20,000 Sarissa-armed phalangites, 10,000 Thracian and Hellenic auxiliaries that, of course, were easy to gather and sort of inflating a bit the numbers, not much the quality, but still, plus 3,000 cavalry bolstered by 1,500 Thessalian horsemen. I made multiple videos about Thessalian horsemen for the military historical unit series, and 1,000 Thracian light cavalry that one will have to do instead, to the coalition, particular in that year against Antigonus I Monophthalmus at the Battle of Ipsus in Phrygia, alongside Seleucus I Nicator, Ptolemy I Soter, and Cassander. This force is naturally telling, like, again, a healthy regional power, mostly stemming from, again, a solid, sort of pacified and organized domain. We see the most important elements being constituted by a congruous amount of cavalrymen, a more solid bulk of, as we've seen, heavy infantry in the traditional Macedonian fashion, and again a bit of flexibility given by this lighter infantry and cavalry that the surrounding tributary peoples would sort of easily provide to such a leader. At Ipsus, Lysimachus' forces held the left flank of the coalition army, using his 20,000-strong phalanx to pin Antigonus' infantry, while his Thessalian cavalry outflanked the enemy's right wing, coordinating with Seleucus' 480 elephants to disrupt Antigonus' cavalry, securing a decisive victory that killed Antigonus and allowed Lysimachus to seize Western Asia Minor, including Lydia, Ionia, and Phrygia, with key cities like Sardis, Miletus, Ephesus, we recounted before, where he stationed something like 5 to 1,000 troops each, as we've seen as a sort of a basic practice. This is really irrelevant because, as you understand it, we'll talk about the Battle of Ipsus, because it's really one of the biggest engagements of the era. And of course, there is relative convention like that allows these various commanders that have really the same experience under Alexander and a hell of a military, not just experience, but just tradition in the form of this veterans of their previous campaigns under the Megas to sustain that sort of enormous proofs of muscular force containing basically the large part of the world just under their march, the appearance of their sarissai and sunlight reflecting aspides. Of course, this was an enormous effort from the side of Lysimachus' domain as well. Like, we're talking, like here, of course, also the numbers, the figures, this will be for other videos, of course, can be relatively debated. Mostly, as far as classical antiquity goes, we get that number, and it's not like there is so much else to wonder. Like, you have that source, be grateful for having that, sort of be healthily skeptical regarding the overall size, but let's also be real about the actual capacities of this force that had literally conquered the world to gather again such enormous amount of force, of manpower, and just the sheer will of great part of the world, moral force. Lysimachus' heavy taxation, however, was also, like in other Diadochos policies, really showing the burden of the military effort, demanding up to 20 talents annually from cities like Miletus, and the imposition of garrisons, fostering resentment among the Hellenic populations who valued their autonomy. As you know, in a very different way, the Macedonian monarchs had historically imposed themselves, and this is very interesting, there were some Hellenic colonists living in Bactria, on in the northeastern province of the Achaemenid Empire, that had not been actually quite happy that another Greek had taken over everything and had started to rule the Macedonian way. After all, they had preferred being under the Persians. So these strains are like just like the effort for the Battle of Ipsus is naturally gigantic, enormous. All those troops would have not been regularly upkept. We know also relatively few about how these troops, especially the Macedonian phalangites, were actually settled as military colonists historically, like in Thrace specifically, not because we don't know how this happened normally, but because, again, Thrace is Thrace, Lysimachus is relatively more peripheral. So there, even the capacity, for example, of levying Hellenic troops, as we've seen, was not even enormous. It was mostly the Thracians that increased the numerical bulk of Lysimachus' forces, but also the same Macedonian levies that were, at least by that measure, dependent on a monarchic regime that could maintain their own colonial status and, in fact, their military communities across this territory, because they largely also lived off of other people's resources, and this was, of course, the key also to their quality of their training and equipment. Lysimachus, minting of silver tetradrachms bearing Alexander's image, struck at Lysimacheia and Sardis, the latter, as you know, very important Ionian center historically, like a bit like the image of the Achaemenid, and now like the conquering Macedonian rule in this frontier land between the Hellenic world and the in fact this barbarian but still somehow advanced and sophisticated hinterland, helped legitimize his rule, but did little to quell dissent among especially the Hellenic polis. There were also the more dynamic communities within at least there were sometimes big centers, there were larger cities in the east, but let's say the Greeks came out integrated with that sort of liberties seeking attitude ingrained, and this brought them to often rebel, and also through this, by the way, the collusion with other rivals of Lysimachus, or even just local barbarians, for example. That's the product of Alexander's conquest of the Hellenistic syncrasies, born out of Alexander's vision on the world that we will, if anything, attempt to introduce at some point. In 288, so consider the decades, the generations here, because we really arrived to Pyrrhus, to Rome, to the Punic Wars, etc. After the deposition of Demetrius I Poliorcetes, that regardless of his nickname and his marvelous, in fact, Poliorcetical military machines, was not a successful ruler and commander at all. In fact, technology is the eternal illusion. This guy had briefly ruled over unified Macedon, right? So Lysimachus claimed half of Macedonia, right? Initially sharing it with Pyrrhus himself, like Pyrrhus of Epirus, that had been a former ally in this. This is very interesting because at times, as you know, the same Epirus had Pyrrhus would spend whole his life to try to conquer Macedon in a way or another. By 285, Lysimachus, in fact, outmaneuvered the same Pyrrhus through diplomatic isolation to prevent Macedon to be fundamentally taken over by the Epirotes, leveraging dissent, in fact, among the same Epirote noblemen, and that were, of course, jealous of their monarch's achievements, as it's a bit here the broader bottom line. And he carried out a swift campaign to seize Pella, the capital of Macedon, where his 8,000-man phalanx defeated Pyrrhus' 6,000 troops in a pitched battle, securing the entire region, including Thessaly in the south, a vital source of 2,000 elite cavalry, 10,000 phalangite levies, and grain supplies, enhancing Lysimachus' military might. This move is brilliant because it shows you how aggressive, bold, but also controlled and wise Lysimachus was. Great political actor and strategic calculator, so to say, succeeding in defeating Pyrrhus, the eagle of the Aeacids, that shared also Alexander's blood in part, and that was, as you know, considered in classical antiquity the greatest commander in history after Alexander. So Lysimachus' military curriculum has a marvelous credit. Lysimachus also expelled Ariston, the legitimate ruler of Paeonia, this, again, half-barbarian country in the north of Macedon, in the northwest of Macedon, consolidating control, in fact, the outskirts of the kingdom that he had secured. This also was very important as far as the connection with Epirus, as it provided Lysimachus access to Illyrian and Dardanian territories that were just looming over Epirus, and other 3,000 light infantry and cavalry for mountain warfare in the ferocious Balkan hinterland, where those tribes dwelled with this terrible tactics. They also made a video about Illyrian warfare that explains this, so if you're interested, you can check that out. This maneuver really was crucial for securing his northern borders, like knocking out this rebellious client king and, certain dominance over a further area across the Balkans. Consider, at this point, you have Lysimachus' peak of power, you have Thrace, Macedon, it's parts of Asia Minor. So some of the most powerful and advanced parts of the world, the very heart of what had been the Argead power, probably the men of silver, right? The ones that are just a step away from being the ones of gold. And remember, these men had been the guys who had been, through which the Holy Ghost had passed, mediated above them only with God the Megas, Alexander, that could be seen as an incarnation of Zeus himself, that surely had his own blood, was understood as his own son. So it's sort of a metaphysical stage of existence that is incredibly leveraging between, say, probably at the touching point of heaven and earth, at deeper existential levels that you can't quite properly understand if you haven't been soaked in that blood, in that dust, but also in the might of heavens and the power of those polities either. However, and this is the point, and that's also why these leaders had failed to keep Alexander's empire together, Lysimachus' fortunes reversed in 281 at the Battle of Corupedium in Lydia, where Seleucus I defeated and killed him. Right, pretty brutal, raw, and like in mafia movies, it's that crude and swift. Most of Lysimachus' Asian subjects, including garrisons in Ephesus and Sardis totaling 5,000 troops, deserted him before or during the battle, reflecting Lysimachus' unpopularity due to oppressive governance, which in part may have fueled those legions. In any case, it's a power that, to an extent, overstretched. Imagine controlling such region, like all the stresses, fighting against the greatest powers like Epirus, having this pretty wide geographic dimension to keep in check. Like if you are moving across this territory, the opposite side of it is going to more easily rebel. There are lots of resources, yes, but also lots of polities that are jealous of their autonomy, that are also looking upon you with suspicion for your possible expansion in their land. So it's really a tough job, like to be a Diadochus, and Lysimachus found out, of course, the hard way. We are probably thinking tax increases of 1/3 up to 1/3 compared to what have been the habitual ones at the time. There is also Lysimachus, that definitely contributed. We can explain the Black Legion controversial execution of his own son, Agathocles, in 284 due to suspicion of treason. It's not like the Macedonian nobility historically had this very intact familiar relations. I mean, think about Philip II and Alexander III. There are lots of voices there. In any case, you must be, probably in that context, it's completely normal again for the nobility to be riding the way, for example, of the leader's blood to stage a rebellion, whatever. So this is all possible, plausible, and realistic, right? You can imagine all the court intrigues involving also his wife Arsinoe II, which also alienated key commanders like Philaterus of Pergamon, and because Pergamon, by the way, was at this point under Lysimachus' rule, 10,000 troops loyal to Agathocles as well. At different times, like these pieces of your own dominion sort of falling apart because of this exquisitely political issues within your own same court and heart of power. That's what also had, in hindsight, fractured Lysimachus' strategical capacity. In fact, we know of 5,000 troops defecting to the same Seleucus before the Battle of Curopedium. That's definitely not a good sign concerning, in whose favor the political climate is tilting. Naturally, Seleucus was at the head of a more robust force, but also one that, again, by odds, was comparable in scale with Lysimachus. Following the death of whom, Ptolemy Ceraunus, nicknamed the Thunderbolt, that's the meaning of, they all had these different nicknames, assassinated the same Seleucus in 281, ironically, near Lysimacheia, and seized Lysimachus' European territories, including Thrace, Macedon, and his remaining army of 15,000 Macedonian veterans and 5,000 Thracian auxiliaries, including 2,000 peltasts. This move sort of shows you how, like, certain specific regional hubs were now consolidating under the rule of this or that Diadochos, that reflected some final sort of cooling off of this enormous cake that Alexander had so marvelously as hastily baked. Lysimachus' revenge was thus post-mortem accomplished by yet another of these competitors, with some important legacy in his name, not just because of Lysimacheia, but of the important control that at different times the same Macedon exercised, in fact, on these eastern territories in the Balkans that had been partially, as previously, stabilized by the same Lysimachos. Ptolemy Ceraunus, by the way, this is just like your life as a Diadochos is not going to be particularly stable at any point, was himself killed in 279 in a sort of swift, sudden way, when his forces were annihilated by another Diadochos. No, the invading Galatians, right? The Celtic tribesmen, where at the Battle of Lysimacheia, where Ceraunus' 12,000 strong army, including 8,000 phalangites and 2,000 cavalry, were outmaneuvered by Galatian chariots and 10,000 lighter infantrymen than the heavier phalangites. Ceraunus' head was raised on a Gallic pike in this grim spectacle, and following a bit maybe on the curse of Lysimachos. That locality, as we've seen, had not brought fortune to too many after all. By the way, I made a video about the Galatian army organization recently. again, these guys were nothing necessarily overpowering, like in this case, they were absolutely able to defeat some Macedonian forces, but at large, like this is what can happen in different circumstances. The divides between cultures were not enormous. The Celts objectively got it, were pretty rough and tough. And, this is the phase that we described also in other videos later on, probably the Gallic Galatian invasion. We talk about the Galatians, we talk about the Skordiskoi, also in the Balkans, because eventually, as you know, they went as far as Greece, but they sacked the Oracle of Delphi, etc., but they were eventually defeated. So, again, history steamrolling everything inexorably in many ways. Now, what can we say about Lysimachus' army in general? So as we've seen, that initial forces in Thrace likely consisted of Macedonian veterans from Alexander's campaigns, supplemented by hired mercenaries and Thracian auxiliaries, such as 2,000 peltas light cavalry, totaling around 6,000 men, including 3,000 heavy infantry and 1,500 Thracian skirmishers, we can think so, suited to the region's rugged terrain. In 313, he faced a coalition of Hellenic cities, Calatis and Istria, Thracians and Scythians, but at least he had managed to convince the Thracians to defect on his side before the encounter, this possibly through bribes of 200 talents of silver or promises of autonomy, a tactic consistent with Lysimachus' diplomatic pragmatism, avoiding major engagement and preserving his forces for future campaigns, because we are still relatively early in time. And so as we've seen how, limited his options really were. With his victory at Calatis in 205, involving the aforementioned feigned retreat to lure 4,000 defenders into an open field ambush, allowing his 2,000-strong phalanx and 500 Thracian cavalry to crush the opposition, securing the city's port for naval operations. Over time, as he gained control of Macedon and Thessaly, as we've seen, he accessed their full military levies, that, remember, were the bulk of the ancient Macedonian, of the older Macedonian power before Alexander's conquest, the heartland of the same Macedonian power. So they were loaded and grabbed with this enormous divine legacy at that point. So there is an unmatched prestige. And so Lysimachus at that point has accessed their full military levies, significantly bolstering his armies with 15,000 Macedonian phalanges trained in the Sarissa armed phalanx and 3,000 Thessalian heavy cavalry. Were pretty darn good shock troops, renowned for their discipline, their maneuvering capacity. Critical at Issus were they were the ones who outflanked Antigonus' cavalry. And so although Lysimachus controlled Hellenic cities along the coast of Thrace and Asia Minor, such as Abydos, Lampsacus, and Ephesus, his unpopularity stemming from heavy taxation up to 20 talents per polis, forced garrisons of 1,000 troops, and cultural insensitivity discouraged recruitment, limiting Hellenic troops to fewer than 2,000, forcing reliance on 10,000 mercenaries and Thracian forces. A Bithynian officer's tale, dated to the aftermath of Curopedion, 281, records the killing of a Thracian and a Mysian, likely soldiers in Lysimachus' army, indicating the presence of local troops from both Lysimachus' European and Asian territories, possibly integrated into his phalanx as 5,000 Sarissa-wielding infantry. This is a very important aspect of the Hellenistic military that had really started since Alexander's times, when he, for example, he discharged most of his veterans, and he began to hire literal Persians and Arabs in his forces. This does not mean, by the way, we're talking proper Sarissophorai here. We're not talking about, as it happened in other instances, of ethnic troops that were interspersed between the subunits of the phalanx, side by side, mostly to compensate for probably Macedonian losses, because the Macedonian was the ethnic term referred to that combat function, right? So the Macedons were the guys who fought like that. But we've seen, for example, in the video about Pyrrhus, notoriously at the Battle of Ausculum, there are also other instances where you have the phalanx interspersing with troops, and people say, "Oh my God, that's to increase the flexibility of the phalanx," because that has nothing to do with that. Simply the function of filling the gaps, of stretching, say, the sort of widening the battle line. People have this thing in mind, this magic, that in this case it's actually a stupid word given the context. Flexibility. The Romans defeated the Macedons, the Hellenistic group, because the Roman legion had more flexibility, and then they don't understand what that actually means in practice. As if, by the way, a Roman legion was just throwing troops everywhere, doing whatever they wanted. Instead, the Macedons did. Had just to resort to flexibility in the form of interspersing other types of troops into the phalanx, as if this phalanx could start dancing or whatever. We are, unfortunately, but that's the limit of, too much Total War games played. I can be within that community as well, but at least I redeem myself later on studying a bit of this thing. By the way, if you're interested, that in the suggested videos, I normally down below in the top fixed comment down below, I post the all the content related to that, because I made a pretty hefty video discussing phalanx legion in comparison. And I actually want to make more videos because there are still people talking about this online. Also, people are supposed to be experts, and that doesn't seem actually that they are more than much. But going back to the actual integration, which was also feasible if you trained them, of in fact this non-Greeks fundamentally, as Macedonian phalanges, we have from Lucian's Dialogues of the Dead, 15, the mention of a Thracian infantryman armed with a Saracen shield, possibly serving Lysimachos, who killed a governor of Media. Right? This is likely happening because Lysimachos' troops never went as far as Media. This was this guy who was slain was a Seleucid subordinate in a post-Curupedian context, suggesting Thracians were integrated into the Macedonian-style phalanx, a practice, again, seen in other Hellenistic armies. It's fairly normal, and I also explained this in other videos, including the one about the Ptolemaic army organization and more. Also, for the Seleucid colonies of probably of other troops among Syrians, Babylonians, Persians, etc., with likely up to 5,000 Thracians in his ranks by 301, right? And so in the ranks properly of also the phalanx itself. This is interesting because very often we don't have the breakdown. Again, if we find the phalanges, rarely the sources tell something like, at this phalange it was actually, and especially not the historiographical ones, this were just recruited from barbarians or whatever. But again, this is a topic we'll have to discuss in another video doc, because I really have to make hundreds and hundreds of videos about Hellenistic warfare, and I can't squeeze everything into a single video at a time. But again, this was completely normal, and it's absolutely plausible that these peoples from different ethnic backgrounds would find themselves to die in a foreign land to their own in the service of a Diadochos, like a guy that had been under Alexander himself, the guy who had taken over their own countries, by the way. Just for saying how the story goes. Now, Lysimachus also employed Illyrian mercenaries, as we've seen. Though his treatment of them was notoriously harsh, Polyaenos records that in 302, 2,000, the aforementioned Autariatae, along with 800 Lycian and Pamphylian troops, deserted to Antigonus I, likely due to Lysimachus' brutal discipline, including massacring mutinous units of 300-500 men to deter others, as seen in 307 campaign against the Triballi near the Nestus river that we referenced before. And again, there are different sources today. I didn't quite digress on those, but they're also the most straightforward. Like in this case, it was Polyaenus' stratagems. So like you can, as a reference, you can check, I don't know, Diodorus Siculus. Of course, there are beautiful scholarship, like there is Bar Kokhba, there is Secunda. You know, these names are actually quite resounding in the community of people obsessed with Hellenistic warfare. Some sources are later. You even have Justin, for example, or Plutarch, just to get slightly earlier in time compared to the events. But overall, like, this is also pretty notorious history, so it shouldn't be that hard. And not just to find references, but also to appreciate how and why, like, we are talking about such a ruler, and especially like why he left a mark in the Hellenistic legacy and memory. Right, you can't check, like, at the end of the video, I don't do it, how many people made a video about Lysimachus? Probably many. I know that some bigger channels are sort of obsessed with, again, the Diadochi, as I was saying at the beginning, they make even more, like, every single minimal battle about this guy. I don't know here if they wrote it the Greek or the Latin way, but Lysimachos, alright. Well, there isn't actually much, interestingly. At least this is the Latin way. Let's search for the Greek way, because I usually use myself the Greek spelling for Greek. Also for the Byzantine. Oh my god, so few? Really? I thought they made, like, the bigger channels made so many videos about him. No, well, I'm really glad to know that I'm going to smash everything up in the process. But again, jokes aside, we have finally, I mean, over time, gradually increasing this playlist about, it should be Hellenistic warfare. Yeah, because Hellenistic warfare is more, I can say vague, but it's at least yeah, not so many videos, especially of the there are 32. This is the 33rd. I mean, it's actually all right if you consider that. It's not really a focus, but again, we should really start that series about because telling the truth, my insight on this is mostly like military. Like, all the videos I've made so far are basically connected with the overall military side of the story. It's not, again, particularly connected with anything specific. Like, again, my content about Hellenistic warfare is just not taking into consideration some broader political background or whatever. I mean, we obviously take that in consideration when we we discussed the context for the military stuff we were discussing. But again, if the text is fundamentally about warfare, like we're not going to particularly expand this in many other ways. And so the result is, because by the way, I ideate this Hellenistic series not just for properly the Macedonian or the Hellenic elements in it. It's mostly just like the period, the era as a whole. So we don't update this too often after all. And this may seem like I actually started this with Schwerpunkt itself, so it's not really a small series. But if, of course, this had been like part of our branches, it may have been updated faster, better, and with way more like Hellenistic stuff. And by the way, you know that on Schwerpunkt I have this sort of this initial phase of the channel that was clumsier with the older videos that I haven't had the courage to delete, because even though I blurred for remember the 2021 copyright purge, even though I have never been like signaled for anything, right? I've always been pretty morigerated. Even at the time, I used actually copyrighted stuff, but blurred, right? So I never gone fully okay. Like still many channels actually do. They copy a lot of stuff. They use full like resolution pictures, and they say, "Oh well, I used this just for a few minutes, or I use it on the thumbnail." That fair use does not quite exist in the sense that you think it does, right? So overall, that older content, let's say, is there blurred, a bit left on his own, but it's still valuable given that it is basically about just like it's about the lesson. Like the content is not bad. I mean, I may have spoken worse, but fundamentally the content is of the same caliber, of the same quality. I have always searched only for the best references. I've always expanded in the way you see me doing in the videos. So I'm actually very very positive about the notion that this content can also integrate. My purpose, and I've been doing it for almost for several months back in the day, 2021, 2022, I should re-upload these videos, but at some point it's so preferable just to remake them. I may actually play that card, like that instead of, so I would delete the old ones, but only when in the cycle the same topic comes up. And I've never really had the courage. I will likely not do. I will leave everything on, because the idea is that if those topics I covered came up first and I actually discussed them and they're available, they're public, there's really no reason for me to simply remake them in the moment. At least I will just let this run, and then we will get to some point where the thing sort of makes a bit more sense, and I can finally just deliver you that content that deserves really to be delivered time after time. Because with Schwerpunkt, it's never been, let's say, quantity, as you see me posting like this way, at the detriment of quality. Right, to me, let's say I've always been able to have this kind of quality because that sort of comes first to begin with. It's something that you can't do without. It's something you can't fake, you can't compromise on. So to me, it's easy because, as you understand, there is not an enormous effort behind sort of the technical side of the story. In the visuals, in whatever, but it's the historical information is always very highly qualitative, and at the end of the day, this is just like a podcast that you can appreciate as such. As for the way I work myself, I really enjoy it. Right, I think it's really stress-free, so to say. It's a fantastic way to learn more, and I'm actually always very, very glad to make these videos, because I learned so much just out of them, the way they are, and so I'm absolutely on board with the way I'm going, and the more I provide in this sense, the better, because I realize that the information is, again, there to be appreciated for what it is, and if you're interested in the history, you will definitely appreciate also the format and whatever. And also the images are not bad. Sometimes I look at certain YouTube videos, and it's just like still images from the Wikimedia Commons that pass by. Some people have understood it. My way to the Wikimedia Commons videos, images are basically the only copyright commercial free. At least you have to give the credits that you see in the end in my videos in order to be used. But I mean, you see in this channel, so the only thing that they do is that they pass by in slow motion, because they look as if they were, oh my god, there's the movement, so the person's eye is caught. I think that the type of images I give, so still, etc., they also reflect how sort of stern but fair I am regarding my content delivery. And this, of course, encompasses pretty much every aspect of the same, because as you have understood well by this point, this is the actual issue. Like, we make videos that make sense from a historical point of view. Who doesn't enjoy them is their problem. Like, I discovered, I think that I don't know how much that's sort of a mix of distrust or some kind of envy. I don't know. I don't understand envy in my character at all. But there are people who are distrustful, and they always tend to sort of discredit every source by saying, like, but this guy does not use it by blogger or whatever. Like they, this is not true. And never I received an actual historical criticism. Actually, the only time I made an interview about the topic, like, the other side was a fellow historian that was enthusiastic. And also, we come from different side of the political aisle, so it could be an excuse just to trash me or whatever instead. I think that when you get what actual history is and what I'm doing in this broader picture, I think that you can't unsee that I'm doing well, and that regardless of the YouTube success, which is also relatively important, I don't really care very much about doing something else. Like, it sort of just like this video on Lysimachus. I'm so glad. I don't know how many people will watch it, because there are many people, again, passionate about Hellenistic warfare. But the fact I see here that nobody has ever done it on YouTube, fantastic. Even if it's so niche, as some people say, it's still what it deserves to be. All right, and that's what I'm going to keep doing. Brief excursion toward the end. However, this was pretty much it for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.